Honey, I blew up the business.
Welcome to the podcast. We've got Matt Lerner here today. Great to see you, Matt.
Lovely to see you too, Dan.
We've been sharing some war stories. We did meet about 10 years ago, but I was Fat Dan then.
And I was Fat Matt.
And we've subsequently sorted out our lifestyle and health, and we're both thinner and better looking, I believe.
I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm taking it. Matt is founder and chief troublemaker at Startup Core Strengths, which offers growth coaching to startup founders and their teams across Europe. Matt's got a bit of a CV, though. And again, I've known him for a little while and been aware of him and what he's been doing. But he spent 15 years as a marketer and mover and shaker in Silicon Valley, including 10 years PayPal when they were, I believe, growing very rapidly. Is that a sort of understatement of the century?
Yeah, they had a pretty good run of it, yeah.
So that was about 2004. And then later joined as a venture capitalist at an incubator accelerator called 500 Startups, where he led 35 early stage investments and led a growth program called Distro Dojo, which helped those startups achieve average growth of 250%, which is a lot, I would suggest, in a 12-month period. So he knows what he's doing when it comes to startups, growth, getting stuff done, and technology. And he guest lectures at Stanford Business School and Imperial College. Funnily enough, we're just working with a startup that's been spun out of Imperial College. Some
bright people there.
Yeah, there's some really bright people and a great team. It's been an absolute joy working with them, actually. He quotes, I'm going to quote him back to himself here. I saw a lot of people making a lot of mistakes, he says, which led to the creation of his company, Startup Core Strengths. And I think mistakes is what we like on this podcast because that's what the raw material of entrepreneurship is all about. Before I forget, I was going to say the podcast, to remind you, is brought to you by my company, The Tech Department, which is the one that I blew up in 2017. And in an attempt to not do that again and to help you learn from my mistakes, we're doing this podcast. So if you do like the podcast, subscribe, give it a 5-star review, share it with your friends and all that good stuff. Matt's been doing that, I'm sure, as soon as this podcast goes live. So thank you. We'll get right into it. I want to go back in time because Matt's been working in Silicon Valley as a part of entrepreneur-led teams and part of entrepreneurial landscape for many years. There's a great quote, again, he said himself, in his first 3 startups. The first 2 were complete disasters, which is a great learning experience. The third, we managed to sell. And I'm keen to find out of those, looking back, these 2 disasters that you were involved in, which contained the richest lessons for you looking back?
The second one was kind of your prototypical, like every startup mistake we see now. They raised too much money, too fast, at too high a valuation, started building tons of really expensive stuff before they validated a market need, hired all these expensive big company executives, burned through everything in less than a year. Yeah, just bridge funding round fell through, and guess what? We're not getting paid this week. I just grabbed, actually, my severance package, I grabbed the ficus from the men's room and walked out the door on Friday when I realized I wasn't getting paid, and that was the end of it. So,
really?
But I guess in terms of the lessons I specifically learned, obviously seeing all of those things happen made a big impression on me. But even, so I grew up in a place called Cleveland, Ohio. We didn't have a ton of money. And, in Cleveland, when you lose a job, you might be unemployed for 2 years. You could end up going on welfare and it's kind of scary. And so for me, just realizing, people can spin a tale and excite investors and raise $20 or $50 million from amazing investors and just completely squander it. And then everyone loses their jobs. And 3 weeks later, everyone has new jobs again. This was just a completely different paradigm than anything I'd seen. So I guess for me personally, one of the big lessons out of that was just realizing getting out of this mindset of scarcity, this sort of zero-sum mindset that I'd grown up with, and realize, hey, it's not just about going and finding a job, but this was Silicon Valley in 1997, and the world is fundamentally changing. And, it's just some of the most extraordinary leaders and companies in history that are starting to get built. Netscape had gone public. And it's not just go find a job so you can pay the bills. It's incredible things are happening. And what do you want to be a part of? And, I approach my job search and my next steps and everything really completely differently.
That's interesting. Is this scarcity mindset? And that comes from your childhood or just the culture you were growing up in?
Yeah, I think so. We didn't have a ton of money growing up, and my dad at some point lost a job, and I think he was probably unemployed for 2 years, and they probably, had a hard time paying the mortgage and feeding their kids and things. And it was definitely, there's still probably pretty high unemployment around the Cleveland area. So I think that's where it came from.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I think there's sometimes a lot of these kind of subconscious things like below the surface that often
Yeah.
come from childhood. So scarcity, particularly around money, is something I struggle with. So you get defensive about things and costs and investments, and it can distort your thinking. So you had this moment of kind of in the 90s, and I guess you're relatively young in your career. It's all happening around you. There's this kind of company that's flown way too close to the sun and then exploded. And you're kind of exiting on a Friday and you're kind of letting these things sink in. So what was going through your mind then as you were going on to the Monday the following week? Was that a fast process, or is that something you can now see that happened over a few years, this kind of learning about more of an abundance mindset?
It wasn't the following Monday, but it was, I started to spend time with people and see where they were going. And like, I had a friend who, we call it getting hit by the luck truck, but he was a programmer, and he'd never even actually graduated. He never went to college. I'm not sure he graduated high school, but, he knew how to code, and he found a job with a company, and a couple months later they IPO'd, and he, just went from barely being able to pay his rent to having like a BMW and a Harley Davidson and all the new boxes of, trainers and like, it's like all this money. I was like, wow, there's crazy stuff going around. And anyone with half a brain had multiple job offers at that point. And I just started thinking to myself, like, okay, so having a job isn't really what this is about. I'll be able to pay the rent. I can find jobs. It's about, what do I want to do and who do I want to be working with? And if I start there, and then I did a lot of introspection, what do I love doing? What kinds of people do I want to work with? What kind of companies do I want to work for? And I'd say that was a process that probably took a few months. And I just sort of had that in my mind as I was looking for opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you started to formulate the what drove you and what you were passionate about. And so this thing had happened, and then you had an exit out of the third one. I was interested in just reading your bio. You had a little period before you started with PayPal, I believe, where you went traveling. Now, I'm curious about this because I think this is often people don't do this at this point in their career. They kind of throw themselves into the next thing. So you've gone through these turmoils, ups and downs, the 90s Silicon Valley sort of thing going on, and then you've had this success. But then you disappear and go traveling. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you learned from that little sojourn?
Sure. Are you asking like, why did I decide to go traveling, or what did I learn on the trip?
Yeah, what drove you to go traveling at the time?
It's even weirder for me because, as you can plainly hear, I'm American, and most Americans don't have passports, and most Americans don't travel. And when they do travel, like they go to Paris or something. And I really, so I had a bit of money in the bank kind of for the first time. And I just sort of thought about like, the Valley is strong. This thing is going to be here. It's going to be here when I get back. I'll be able to find a job and I've got some cash. And given that, there's some stuff I want to go do. And right now, like I'm young, I don't have a mortgage. My knees still work just fine. Like I want to go see the world. So something I'd sort of always in my mind thought someday when I retire or whatever, I want to go do all these things. And I thought, you know what, let's just do it now. And I think that's probably common. Well, when I was traveling, it was obviously common among Australians. And I think, in a lot of cultures, that's normal. So I just, decided to get out there and do it. And I even had enough frequent flyer miles to, that it was fairly easy to even just get on the flights. As I was traveling, that's kind of one of those red pill, blue pill moments. It's hard to even, I could probably list a blog post of 5 things I learned, but you become a different person, right? So I was, traveled all across Africa, much of Asia, trekking, Nepal, Bangladesh. I wouldn't even know where to start on that. But I think it very much reinforced for me. Well, actually, one thing that really surprised me was after about a year of doing this, I got bored. And this is kind of a weird epiphany. So I was in youth hostel in Florence, Italy. And I was sort of looking at my schedule and like, okay, more museums, more Renaissance paintings, more Botticellis, more gelato, and like, boy, that's a nice problem to have, like being bored of going to museums and seeing the greatest art in history. But I wanted to get stuck into something. I was restless, my mind was spinning. I was trying to think of businesses to start and people I could help. And that sort of really showed me like, even if I had all the money I ever needed, and I certainly didn't at this point, it wasn't that kind of exit, I'd always want to be working. And that really gave me a lot of reflection and introspection about what matters to me. What am I looking for? How do I want to spend my life? And then, traveling around, meeting other travelers, people who had sold companies before, people who were running businesses, and just seeing like, what are all the different options, much bigger set of options than I ever imagined were out there.
Really? And so what were the options that most interested you at that point?
I think I knew when I came back, I knew one thing I could definitely do was marketing. And I knew I wanted to work with really bright, interesting people, people where, it sounds so cliche, but, people I could learn from and people who would challenge me. And so then when I came back and I started looking around and talking to people, that's what I felt when I met Dave McClure and, some of the folks he was working with at PayPal. There wasn't a lot of the sort of office politics and drama and things. It was just, people thinking about a business and how to grow it and, hey, let's try this and let's try that. And what seemed like a massive business opportunity and some just really straightforward, smart, sensible people. And I was I was excited to work with those guys.
So you've got this sort of period of time where you've got the early 90s or late 90s bit where you're these sort of the startups, and then you've got the traveling bit. And what I'm curious to just what drives you really with this sort of, what was the sort of the values or perhaps the sense of mission that sort of got you to be attracted to PayPal at that point? Was it sort of like a composite of the traveling experience and the previous startup experiences?
I think calling it a mission or a vision at that stage of my life would be too grand. I'd only just figured out that I'd be able to reliably put food on my own plate. But what drives me in general is I'm a puzzle solver. I really like thinking about this stuff that I do. I studied cognitive psychology in undergrad, and I've always enjoyed, experimenting and A/B testing and thinking about businesses and strategies and how they grow. And, this was a chance to work with people who were world-class at that, really fast-growing and dynamic business. And, to have a fair amount of freedom to sort of pursue that how I wanted. So for me, my last name is Lerner, and literally I think that's it. Like for me, my life is a learning journey. So I'm just always asking myself, what's the next big learning opportunity? And that's what drove me there. And that's what drove me when I was there, really. Yeah,
the learning journey. I think that's a great one. And I actually highly recommend everybody goes and checks out. We'll post the links to your website on the show notes and description. But he's got a fantastic ebook called Growth Hacking for Founders. And the Lerner name, Learner by Name, Learner by Nature, is very true. It's full of fantastic insight, but built, I would argue, I observe, on this idea of learning and experimentation and discovery of the world, call that marketing or strategy or people. And so this sort of principle of learning seems to be a very much baked into the PayPal culture. Could you just, again, looking back at that time, what would be the sort of big takeaway for you, having gone through that incredible experience with one of the big global tech sort of icons now? What would be the biggest lesson or the suite of lessons that you took from that?
Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I think the lessons, there were a lot of lessons I learned day to day about how do you grow a business? How do you work in an organization? PayPal grew massively from when I joined was still arguably sort of looked like a startup. The company I left had, I think, like 20,000 employees and 11 billion in revenue. And that's just such a completely different animal. And, basically a cog in a corporate machine at that point. So I learned a lot of sort of tactical lessons about, how do you operate in an organization? How do you get an organization, to align incentives and do the right things for the business and for customers? And how do you help other people in an organization be successful and all that kind of stuff? But the biggest lesson for me came into stark relief when I became a VC, because, as a VC, you see pitches every day. And I probably looked at 1,000 businesses in 3 or 4 years as a VC. And the big thing that struck me is that most people operate with the implicit assumption that a startup is a small version of a big company. And I knew from my own experience and from watching, and knowing people at many of the most successful startups in history, that at the beginning, it's nothing like that at all. And let's talk about both of those and what that means. So when I say there's this implicit assumption a startup is a small version of a big company, you get some traction, you impress some investors, you raise a Series A, got a few million. And the first thing you do is draw an org chart and go out and say, okay, we're going to have, compliance and finance and marketing and sales and operations and. And then you go out and you hire people as best people you can to run each of these departments because you're the founder and you don't really know how to do these things and you want to hire people smarter than you. And these experts come in and they know how to set up their departments and they draw up their plans and strategy and they give you a list of headcount requests and budget asks and a bunch of software they're going to need and a bunch of engineering work they're going to need to support. And you look in it all together and you can afford maybe 20% of that stuff. And then you're in this really uncomfortable position where, or God help your CTO who says, I've got, this much engineering resources. Should we support marketing because product-led growth sounds pretty important? Or should we do the core product roadmap? Or the compliance team says we have to do these things or we're going to be out of compliance and that's illegal. And then I know in my heart of hearts that the code base is a mess because we've grown so fast. And do we refactor the code base and do the iOS 15 required updates so we get kicked out of the App Store? And a CTO isn't qualified to make those trade-off decisions between marketing, compliance. So you end up trying to move in so many directions and everything feels like a priority. And you end up doing a little bit of each of those things and it feels kind of half-assed and you don't like it and it doesn't work. And you don't know if that's because you did it half-assed or because you hired the wrong people or because it was never a good idea in the first place, or if you should double down and keep after it or back up. So it gets very messy really fast. So that's the small version of a big company mess, that movie that I just keep seeing over and over again. The way I work with startups and what I've seen the most successful startups do is in the early stage, the company only has one job, it's growth. So Paul Graham's definition of a startup is it's a company built to grow fast. And so what that means is, and this is, I wasn't at PayPal in the very early days, but if you look at it, if you read the histories in the podcast with these folks, they had this idea that it was going to beam money from one Palm Pilot to another in 1998. And that turned out to be a bad idea because no one used Palm Pilots. Basically they were trying to launch Venmo in 1998 and that just wasn't going to work. So then they said, okay, that didn't work. Together, they brainstormed 10 other use cases because you could also email money. And they went out and tried to validate and prove each of those, and none of those worked. But then they kind of noticed that eBay sellers were starting to use the product. And even though that was never really their vision for it, you can't ignore the traction. And so they ended up doubling down on eBay. But my point of the story here is all these smart people, Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman, and these guys were all together in a room saying, how do we grow this business? They weren't like, okay, let's hire a head of marketing and give them a budget and good luck getting customers. So marketing is the hardest thing. Getting customer acquisition and growth is the hardest thing. It's not marketing. Customer acquisition and growth is the hardest thing any startup will ever do, right? If you're running a quantitative hedge fund, the hardest thing you do is design trading algorithms, to get you an edge in markets. Well, same thing in a startup. This is a very hard challenge. There's a fixed amount of people and budgets and time and attention. There's a fixed amount of consumption in the world. And an ever-increasing number of startups and established companies who are fighting for that fixed pie, right? So this battle gets harder every year. So you need your absolute smartest people thinking about growth. And so, sorry, this is kind of a long-winded rant, but
that's good.
The most successful startups, what they do is they take their absolute smartest people, all the functions of the company work together on growth. So to give you like a micro example of that, suppose we'll take our compliance person we hired to do our compliance department. So if you're a fintech company, you have a North Star metric. It's not revenue. It's going to be the value you deliver to customers. So it might be weekly active users. And you're going to say to each person, hey, your job isn't compliance. Your job is to increase weekly active users in a way that keeps us out of jail. And, product person, your job isn't make great product, it's increase weekly active users. And so everyone's thinking about doing their job, but in the lens of this shared challenge that you all face. That's the only way to win, right? Because if you're trying to knock over, if you're that fintech company, you're trying to knock over the banking industry, right? The banking industry has 1 million employees and $1 trillion in free cash flow. It's insane, right? You're not going to outwork them. You have to outthink them. You're not going to beat them by making a tiny version of Barclays, right? The only way to do it is if you can outthink them and outmaneuver them. And the only way to do that is if your entire company is able to move quickly and work as a single unit and move in a single direction at once. That's the biggest thing I learned in hindsight from my time at PayPal.
That's real gold, that whole kind of focus piece. Because this is something that we all, again, really, the reason my business exploded was a lack of focus and a lack of actual shared, let's call it energy, focus, pull around a single, you call it a North Star metric, right? Mm-hmm. Funny enough, we use that concept of a North Star in a method we use, but the idea of a single point of direction of travel, I think is really useful because you can orient yourself on that and everyone can say, well, are we going towards that or away from that? It's like going towards the North Star. You can, which way you're going, and you can
it makes this very easy for people, to understand which work they should be doing.
Yeah, and I think what I love about what you've just said there is this sort of coalescence of everybody around that fact and the observation and the understanding that a startup is not the same thing as a mini big company. And I love that, how you kind of get everybody around that shared purpose. And the question then isn't, how do I do my operations department best practice based on industry averages? It's how do I deliver weekly active users, and that's whatever that is.
That's a very hard mindset shift for most people, because if you've become head of compliance somewhere, you're good at it, right? In your whole career, you've been good at it means you're good at complying and getting everyone to do their trainings and KYCing everybody. And now we're asking you to make actually compliance as the secondary part of your job. And that's a weird, scary, uncomfortable thing for a lot of employees. And that puts a real challenge on the leaders of a startup.
Yeah, that just throws up the whole piece there around leadership. As the founder or the kind of chief dudes in the business, How does that happen in your experience?
Can you elaborate a bit on that question?
How do you get people to go from perhaps a technician mindset to a North Star metric, I'm going to help grow the startup growth mindset?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think the best leaders I've seen, look, I don't have all the answers and all the formulas here, but the best leaders I've seen, they do a couple of things. First of all, the vision, the goal, the North Star, they just over communicate it and make it very clear to everyone. I forget who told me this, but it's like working your way up the pole in a company. It's bad if you repeat yourself. And then once you're running the company, you do nothing but repeat yourself over and over again. Part of it is making it very clear. The next piece of it is you get what you get what you inspect, you get what you measure, not what you expect. Genuinely holding people accountable to achieving that North Star or not. And then the third piece of that, which is absolutely critical, is because you've got a bunch of people who worked in companies where your job was to comply and not make mistakes, because right all the way through school, get the highest scores, don't make mistakes, get a good job, don't make mistakes. Suddenly in a startup, like mistakes are guaranteed. And if you're afraid to make them, then you're not taking risks. And if you're making them and you're trying to hide them, then you're not learning from them. We talked about learning journey. If you're building a startup, like it is a learning journey. Right? If you take it as a given that like someday a business like ours will be successful, there's a market out there, someone's going to find it, someone's going to capitalize on it, right? Facebook wasn't the first social network. They were the first ones who cracked the puzzle on how to build a social network. So if you take that as a given assumption that there will be a successful business doing what we do, then the question is, who's going to solve it first? Who's going to crack the puzzle and figure out how this business is going to work? So it is a race to learn faster than anyone else in your space, which means literally you've got to make mistakes and be wrong faster, more and faster than anyone else. And this, again, is a very uncomfortable thing for employees. So sounds cliche, growth mindset. But as a leader, the way you cause that, I think, is just like you're doing on this podcast, it's by talking openly about your own mistakes. And I think that creates space for everybody else to talk about their mistakes and really spend time unpacking the learnings from those mistakes and just creating a culture where it's okay to talk about those things.
In your book, you talk about this and how to lead for mindset, but this idea of almost have a Slack channel, #lessons. I love that. And I'm actually thinking of completely stealing that for my business because I'm trying to, again, through the podcast and through my company culture, encourage that because everybody knows that failure is where all the lessons are. But then practically day to day, it's very difficult to actually admit it in the moment.
But if you look at any of those, great startup success stories, because we always, survivorship, hindsight bias just really blinds us. All of those things, like they were the result of lots of mistakes. So Airbnb, they took about 5 years to find product market fit. I think they were founded in like 2007 and really started taking off in like 11 or 12. And people know about this famous Craigslist hack where they created a script where you could post your Airbnb listings on Craigslist around the world, and it brought them a ton of traffic.
But I'm not sure everyone does know about that because that's kind of something I read that in your book and I was like, I didn't know that. I didn't know about Airbnb, and I've read about Airbnb, but what was it that they got that specific thing there? Because that's quite an interesting detail that perhaps people wouldn't be aware of. What was the Craigslist connection?
Okay, so what actually happened there was they had properties on their platform and they just weren't getting enough traffic. They weren't getting enough renters. And they figured out that people who do want to rent properties right now, they tend to look on Craigslist. And they had already figured out that you can kind of write a crawler that will interact with Craigslist and pretend to be a human. You can't do that anymore, but you could back then. And so basically, anytime somebody would post a property listing on Airbnb, they just made it like click a button and they will cross-post that listing and the images and the description onto different Craigslists around the world. And if anyone clicked on those properties, it would take them back to the Airbnb website to book the property. But they did that, I forget, in like 2009 or 10, like 4 or 5 years into the company. In hindsight, it's obviously a brilliant idea. Why didn't they just do that in the beginning? Like, what were they doing for 3 or 4 years before that, right? That's what no one asks, right? They were doing stuff that didn't work. They were trying other stuff that didn't work and they were learning from it. So the thing they did right before that was they wrote a crawler. They went onto Craigslist and started emailing landlords, pretending to inquire about their properties and then asking them if they wanted to cross-post their properties on Airbnb. And that didn't really help their business because it turns out they had enough properties and landlords, couldn't be bothered to do that. But what they learned from that was that, yes, we can programmatically engage with Craigslist. What they learned is, okay, when we get more landlords, that doesn't actually grow our business because what we need more of is renters, right? So they were trying stuff that didn't work that made them a little bit smarter and eventually got them to the thing that did work.
Yeah, it's interesting because in effect, failure isn't the failure. There's a win in there because the win is the piece of information that is the dotted line to the breakthrough.
Exactly. Exactly. I think so. When I work with companies, I think most people in big companies, people with finance or investing backgrounds, have this sort of vending machine model, mental model of a business where you put some resources and money in one side, people do work, and that generates revenue. And in an established company, with performance marketing channels, it kind of works like that. But in a startup, you can only get revenue if you get customer engagement. If you get customer engagement, then getting revenue is very easy. But getting customer engagement is very hard, right? If you have 1 million weekly active users on a software platform, it's not that hard to monetize. But going from 0 to 1 million monthly active users is extremely challenging. So the new mental model first is, you do work and invest money, and that brings you customer engagement, and customer engagement brings you revenue. But then the next piece off the back of that is we don't know how to get customer engagement. So it has to be learning. So it's people and resources do work. That causes learning. The learning causes customer engagement, and the customer engagement causes revenue. So first and foremost, what you need to build in an early startup is a learning machine.
I love that. What I really actually admire about what you've done in your career, and I want to get onto your company, but is the turning of those lessons into a repeatable, scalable, teachable machine. And I love that because I try and live that out myself from the mistakes I make, big and small. But it's hard. But I think that is true. There's a truth there because you can't ever know what's happening in advance. I want to leave this leads me on actually to this idea of concentrating your efforts on growth and around learning. Can you talk to us about the 1-inch punch?
Yeah, sure thing. If you Google this, it's a great little video of Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch. And so it's literally, he's standing in front of a guy so first of all, Bruce Lee's not a big dude. I don't know in UK, but in the US, he'd be about 5'6" and he weighed like 140 pounds. So really not a very big guy. And he's standing in front of a full-sized grown adult and he punches 1 inch and the guy flies backwards, lands in a chair, and then the chair scoots about 6 feet back from that. I mean, just absolutely knocks the guy. When he talks about this, the point of it, the 1-inch punch, is that every muscle fiber in his body is firing all at the same time in the same direction. So you've probably seen videos of Bruce Lee with like electrodes attached to his muscles and everything. I mean, what made him so effective, physiologists now tell us, is, we have all these muscle fibers, but at any given time, most of them don't all fire in sequence in the same direction. When you learn a sport, swinging a bat or jumping or whatever, what you're doing is your training is getting more and more of those muscle fibers, recruiting more bundles of muscle fiber to fire in unison in the same direction. So startup, same thing. You've got this tiny little company, and the only way to knock over the big companies is just like, we talked about earlier, if everybody's able to sort of fire in unison and align and move in the same direction. That still doesn't feel like it should work because, Bruce Lee was maybe 30% smaller than this guy, but a company's like 1/1000th the size of the big industry incumbent they're trying to knock over. The reason it works is because most of what companies do is wasteful and inefficient. So this was another big thing I learned at PayPal. Like when I looked back on it, all of our growth came from about 5 things. Early getting onto eBay, partnering with shopping carts and hosting companies, reaching out to web developers, just like, some of our sales efforts. That's not all the stuff we did. In the time there, we redid the logo twice. We built a bunch and launched a bunch of wallet products nobody ever used. We squandered probably 70 to 90% of all of our resources. And so if you start with the assumption that 90% of your growth is going to come from like 10% of the stuff you do, that you can build a $10 billion turnover company by doing 5 things well, if you start with that assumption, then the biggest decision you make is, what are we not doing? Progress is deciding what not to do. So remember, we talked about small version of a big company, and you've got to do this thing and that thing and tick this box and that box. Most of that stuff, if you don't do it, it's not great, but it won't kill you. And so Mark Randolph, actually, the founder of Netflix, talks about this. He says, they're asking me to do 1 million things and make 1 million decisions every day. And I'm asking myself, if we don't do this, will it kill the company? No. Okay, it's off my plate. If we do this really well, will it be so big and impactful that nothing else matters? We'll just be a huge success? Yes. Okay, that's the thing I'm going to worry about right now. So it's really making very good decisions so it's not just the focus on the 1-inch punch, but then using this learning process to get smarter and make very, very good decisions about which work you do and trying to find that 10% of stuff that's going to make all the difference in the world for your company.
Yeah, I love there's a quote there. Some words of yours. Progress is deciding what not to do.
I should attribute that. Jack Butcher actually came up with
Really?
that, I think.
Well, I'll just write it down because I love it. And I want to stick it, an unrealized series of merch from this podcast of great quotes like that. That's a great one. Progress is deciding what not to do. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt and wear it in the house because I need to learn from that myself.
It might actually be Steve Jobs. He's the one who said, I think, like, progress is saying no to 1,000 good ideas or something like that. But
yeah.
anyways.
There's a book called Essentialism. We have been very influenced by that. That's the whole thing. Less but better is his mantra. Doing fewer things to get a bigger impact. And I think the disciplined pursuit of less he talks about. But that's a practice I try and have myself. So this is great, and there's so much fantastic lessons in there. What I'm curious about is you've had this amazing experience at the sort of ringside seat at these incredible and within these incredible startups, and then investing in them and being a kind of mentor and coach within the startup community. And then a few years ago, you set up your own business, your own entrepreneurial journey. I'm just curious, how did that feel, switching from sort of one side of the fence to the other? Like how, in that over the last 3 or 4 years, how did that feel?
You know what got me there? I think growing up, I guess we talked already, I guess, about survivorship bias, but growing up, you read about entrepreneurs, and I see people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and I always thought, I'm just not one of those guys. I don't have what it takes to be an entrepreneur, because I was looking at, the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. But when I became a VC, and I started to meet lots and lots of entrepreneurs at the beginning of their journey, and I realized they're actually an extremely heterogeneous group. And I would see these people and you sort of quietly think to myself, gosh, I could do that really easily. And this person's business is pretty successful. And frankly, I think, I could do a better job running it than them. Not everybody. I've met some truly extraordinary founders. But I guess what I realize is it's not as binary as like you're Elon Musk or you're not. And even though I don't have, a lot of the things I think it takes to be a great entrepreneur, I'm pretty good at marketing. I'm pretty good thinking about marketing strategy and how to grow a business. And I'm pretty good with talent. Throughout my career, I've been able to hire very good people and put them in a position to do their absolute best work and really enjoy it. And it turns out, I think if you can get customers and you're pretty good at spotting talent and putting them in a position to be successful, that's actually a lot of what it takes to be a successful entrepreneur. So even though I'm not, the super engineering computer genius, and I'm not the crazy confident, over the top salesperson or any of that stuff, so you know what, I can do this. I think I'd really regret it if I went through my career and didn't start a business. So that was kind of the thinking that led me to it.
In that moment, perhaps the first day in the office with your new thing, how was that a liberating feeling when you actually finally took the decision and took the leap?
No, it really wasn't. I'd say this has been a pretty uncomfortable thing all along for me. I'm back to zero. I'm back after 10 years at PayPal. I was kind of an expert in all things PayPal, and then after the beginning of being a VC, I was a complete idiot. But by the end, again, I felt, a fair amount of confidence. And here I was kind of back to zero. And I don't thrive on that feeling of like knowing I don't know enough and I'm going to screw up everything. And I don't really feel comfortable kind of in the number one seat in an organization. But I knew that I was pushing myself out of my comfort zone for a reason, and that I have to make myself uncomfortable and give myself challenges or I'm not going to grow. So I knew I belonged there, but I wouldn't say that at that stage was liberating. Liberating was, later when I started to get customers. The first time I started to get customers I'd never heard of and never met before. The first time I started getting customers who were referred by other customers, just points in the business where it finally started to take over. I think those were the best feelings. And also just some of the people, the caliber of the people I get to work with, my coaches, some of my clients. I think I'd say those are the highs for me.
Yeah, great. It's a constant battle. I wrestle with this all the time. Like I've been running my business for, 19 years this year. We're nearly 19. But yeah, it's like, I love the highs, but it comes with the whole, I'm growing all the time. Let's just put it that way. I'm constantly finding myself in uncomfortable scenarios, which frankly, learning experiences, he says, doing inverted quotes.
I think if you're a learning junkie like you and I, starting a company is the best thing you can do. Compared to being an employee of a company, I think as an entrepreneur, the learning is just 10x because it's so wide open and nonlinear, and you're there and then the website goes down and suddenly you have to learn what makes websites go down and how to get them back up. And then
I love that. It's non-linear for sure. And you have, it's a constant learning experience. It's very true. And I think learning junkies, maybe we should have our own website, a little community somewhere online where the learning junkies can talk about their habit and share tips or something to how to cope. Well, we're sort of heading towards our end of our podcast time. I'm really interested to ask you a question, which I often ask my guests. You've been immersed in startup land, immersed in entrepreneur land with entrepreneurs and being an entrepreneur now. You're full of great information, but what advice should other entrepreneurs ignore?
I love that question. So I think entrepreneurs get no shortage of advice. We talked about this when I was with 500 startups. We talked about this. We called it mentor whiplash because, people would spend 3 months in our accelerator and they talk to so many brilliant entrepreneurs and, VCs, and nobody lacks for confidence in this industry. It's easy to be an expert when you're talking about somebody else's company and have all the answers. And, people are quite insistent about you should do this and you should do that. And so I guess the cheeky answer is they should probably ignore most of it because I find, all of that advice comes from people who are coming from different contexts and different situations and different experiences. And ultimately, number one, no one else is sitting in your seat and seeing everything you see about your customers and your business model and your investors and employees. No one has all that much information to make a decision. And two is none of those people have to live with the consequences. I mean, the investors will take a write down in their portfolio where they'd rather have a markup, but it's a portfolio, right? It's really not on anyone other than you. So my first advice would just be take it all with a certain grain of salt and just bounce it off of, common sense. And don't be afraid to ignore any piece of advice that doesn't feel right. I try not to believe it or not, because I'm a coach, but I try to, instead of giving advice, I try to talk about experiences I've had, things I've seen, and then explain why I think they were the right thing in that particular situation and give someone enough context to sort of try to understand. But I'm sort of talking around the question. I think if I had to say one specific piece of bad advice I hear a lot is people say, well, we're going to raise our next round and we're going to hire a head of growth to come in and turn on the tap. And I think a lot of investors, when they hear that, they smile and nod and think that sounds like a good idea. And as I think we've talked about at length, startup growth is everyone's job and you need all of your smartest people. And this idea that you're going to hire this rainmaker who's going to come in and turn on the tap, and these days, the talent market is so thin and it's so hard to hire good people in any case. And even in a weaker talent market, it's just, the odds are quite long that you're actually going to be able to pull that off. And even if you do, if that person only has marketing resources and doesn't have access to engineering and all the levers you really need to product-led growth, all the levers you need to pull to grow a company, no matter how clever and great they are, they're not going to be in a position to succeed if they don't have all the resources of the company behind them.
We need that single 1-inch punch. Bosh! Send the market reeling across the room. That's such great advice there throughout. And seriously, I'm taking a lot from this. I'm going to re-listen to it myself because it's really good gear. Where should we send people to learn more about Matt Lerner?
So startupcorestrengths.com, I've got a blog on there. And I send a 2-minute email every week with a simple, clear piece of actionable advice, something around growing a startup, the kind of stuff I've been talking about, but it's usually a lot more tactical than that. And people can subscribe on my blog, startupcorestrengths.com, if they would like a little more.
Great. Well, we'll put all those links into the notes and descriptions, startupcorestrengths.com. I highly recommend, because it's full of really good stuff and the book is really great. And it's got me thinking a lot about our marketing and how we're talking to customers and how we're kind of focusing our attention on growth, which is something we're looking at the moment. So seriously, good stuff. So thanks, Matt. You've been an absolutely great guest, full of great information. Love hearing your stories. Hopefully see you soon and I'll see everybody next time.
Do you want to get the top 5 tidbits from each episode emailed to your inbox every Friday? Yes, you do. It saves you having to go through and make notes and make a note of all the books and all the ideas that are in the podcast. We go through and we choose the top 5 we like, plus put all the links into that email. So if you just go up to honeyblew-up-the-business.com, yes, that's honeyblew-up-the-business.com, and just enter your email address. There's a little box, just enter it in and we will send you that information. And it saves you having to make notes and all that. That's make your life a bit easier. And of course, if you did enjoy the episode, please consider subscribing. We are trying to help people through this. So the more people that subscribe, review, rate on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, the more people will see it and the more we can help. So help us help other people, other entrepreneurs like you. And before I go, I've got to say big up to my company, the tech department, the company we blew up and put back together again. They're generously supporting me on this mission through the podcast. So if you guys want to have a look at a company that can really help you improve your technology, make it better so your business gets better too, boosting your sales and your profit and a bit more sanity in your life, a little less stress, then head up to the techdept.com, the tech department. My company, give us a look. On behalf of all of us here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.